It's episode 700 of the Locked On Rangers podcast. On today's show, I'm breaking down Jon Gray's season, the good, the bad. What is he expected to do next year? And did he live up to what he was expected to do this year? All that and more on this episode of Locked On Rangers. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Rangers, your daily Texas Rangers podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are locked onto the Texas Rangers. I'm Bryce Patrick, a cripplingly addicted Texas Rangers fan since 2010, the founder and host for all 4 seasons of this Locked On Rangers podcast. Today is Tuesday, October 18th, the last day of the ALDS and the first day of the NLCS between the Pirates and the Phillies. Going to be a very, very fun matchup there with quite a few former Rangers in those games. If you're not already, you can follow me on Twitter at Bryce Patrick. You can follow the show at Locked On Rangers and subscribe on YouTube, where the best way you can help grow the show is to comment anything below. Now, today's episode, we're talking about Jon Gray's season, what he did well, what he did poorly, what were the expectations coming in, and if he lived up to those, and kind of comparing him to some of the other pitchers the Rangers might have went out and signed this offseason, or maybe even this upcoming offseason, because there's going to be quite a few pitchers to sign this winter. Now, let's start with the overall numbers. How well did he do? Finished the season with a 1.4 WAR according to Baseball Reference, 1.8 according to Fangraphs. I like that better because it's a little bit nicer to him. I don't know why Fangraphs likes him so much better. I think they value the kind of strikeout pitchers a little bit more and limiting the walks. I think that's why they didn't value Martin Perez this season, as much as Baseball Reference did. I'm not exactly sure on their specific calculations. They don't consult me on those numbers, but Fangraphs liked Jon Gray's season just a little bit better. Finishes the year, if you care about pitcher record, with a 7-7 record, which is kind of impressive on a 90-plus loss team. He had 24 starts, 127 and a third innings, 134 strikeouts, and a 3.96 ERA. His ERA plus was literally 1 point below league average. League average is 100. He has an ERA plus of 99. His fielding independent pitching really liked him, because one of the things that he did well was limit the walks. I didn't really realize that about him. I guess I could have kind of seen that from his numbers, but what he's done in his career, he had a lower walk rate per 9 this year than he did in his career, a higher strikeout rate, and somehow a higher home run rate, while his home park was not Coors Field. Just a little peculiar. Just a little bit peculiar. Maybe it's that he wasn't facing the Dodgers as many times a year, or the Padres, or the Giants. I think that might have helped. I mean, granted, he had to face the Astros quite a bit, but still, they did fairly well this season. He didn't quite live up to exactly what I expected, but let's start with the good. We'll get to the bad and the ugly and the expectations and comparisons later on in the show. But one of the good things, and one of the things that the Rangers were able to convince Jon Gray of when he came here, his slider was his best off-speed pitch. But the Rockies, they aren't super great at player development. They aren't great at a lot of things. And they said, well, your slider's pretty good. This is about as good as it's going to get. And the Rangers are like, your slider is really good, but we're going to make it better. And they taught him a sweeper. That was a big point of emphasis in spring training. He and Dane Dunning both added a sweeper, which is a different kind of slider. His traditional slider breaks more up and down, whereas the sweeper has more horizontal movement. So it's just kind of a different look, a different way to get hitters off balance while adding a new pitch, but still not really adding a new pitch. I wish that they could have differentiated these on some of his numbers on Baseball Savant, but you know what? We'll live with it. One of the things that he did well, according to those Baseball Savant numbers, is most of his stuff was right around the middle of the pack, with the walk rate. The only thing that he was really, really bad at was the fastball spin rate. He was in the bottom 8% of baseball in fastball spin rate, even though he doesn't use a sinker anymore. Usually those sinkers have a lesser spin rate. Four-seamers, you want to have a higher spin rate. This year he had faster velocity on his four-seamer, but the spin rate went down, which usually those two things don't happen. Usually when you have a higher spin rate, they were talking about this in the game where Joe Musgrove was dominating in the playoffs, and where they had where old Bud tried to call his bluff and said he had some sticky stuff on his ear because Joe Musgrove's spin rate was up and so was his velocity just a little bit. But that's kind of what happens when you get a little more amped. You throw a little bit harder, and that spin rate goes up because the spin rate per mile per hour goes up a little bit as well. But that was not the case for him. He was able to have success without a high rate of spin on his fastball, but the velocity was in the top 16% of baseball, 84th percentile. I don't know why I do that. It just kind of gives it a little bit more clarity depending on how you view things. But he used his fastball a little bit more often this year. He used the slider somehow a little bit less. Everything was kind of similar. It wasn't too much of a difference in how often he was throwing things. The biggest difference was his fastball. He threw 3% more of the time. The slider he threw 2% less. Changeup he threw just a smidge more, and the curveball he threw just a smidge less. Not a whole big difference. He didn't have that sinker that he used from 2017 to 2020. He cut that out last year and did not use that again this year. But I think using that sweeper, he was really heavy on the fastball and the slider. The slider used 36% of the time. Fastball he used just over 50% of the time. So very much a fastball slider kind of guy, but the changeup was solid. The curveball was fine, different, another, change of pace kind of thing. The slider using the sweeper, I think the sweeper was just a little bit slower than his traditional slider because the miles per hour went down 2 miles per hour or 1.8 miles per hour on that slider this year, while the fastball velocity ticked up just a little bit. But he had a very effective time using that new sweeper to get some of those easy outs because he is primarily a strikeout pitcher, but occasionally you have to be able to get those easy outs so you can go deeper into games, which he did a decent amount this season, but not quite as much as you would have liked for the guy who was supposed to be your number one going into the season. The highest expectations of anybody were definitely on Jon Gray. Granted, he ended up being the second best pitcher the Rangers had, but the Rangers really could have used him a little bit more. Injuries early on, which is one of the things that I was concerned about. I did, going into the offseason, he was my number one priority of signing a pitcher. Obviously, Clayton Kershaw was like the dream, but that was a bit of a fever dream. But the more realistic dream was to go get Jon Gray, who somehow wasn't a restricted free agent because the Rockies are a very, very incompetently run franchise. So the Rangers were able to go get him, bring him back a little bit closer to home, the Oklahoma kid. And you know what? He had a pretty solid season, but the injuries were the big thing that stood in the way of having a good season versus a great season. I'm going to get into that and a little bit about his dominant 2-month stretch that made you see, okay, this is what the Rangers were looking at when they wanted to go sign him. We're going to get into all of that. But first, this episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline.net is your number one source for your football betting info this season. Find all the latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, and in-depth articles and analysis on every single game you can find. As always, BetOnline remains your continued source for all of your sports wagering information with live betting and up-to-the-minute scores for every sport out there. The Mavericks start their season tomorrow. I think you can bet on some Stars hockey. They're doing really, really well. I think Dak Prescott is coming back this week off the injured list, whatever it's called in football. I just know it in baseball terms, but you can go bet on those Cowboys to bounce back after a loss to the Eagles. But BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to check on all of your favorite games and events, including Major League Baseball, MMA, boxing, and golf. Head to betonline.net or use your mobile device to learn more, because BetOnline, it's where the game starts. Now, like I said, Jon Gray's injuries were a bit of a problem. He has not been able to hit the 200 inning mark in his career. He's been in the big league since 2015. Granted, he only pitched in 9 games that year as a lowly 23-year-old, which, by the way, he blew through the system pretty quickly after getting drafted number 3 overall out of Oklahoma for the Rockies. But he has not been able to give a 200 or even 180 innings in his career. I think the best case scenario, I said 180 innings. I didn't think that was necessarily realistic. Yeah, his career high was 172 in a third innings back in 2018. Last year, the 3 last full seasons, most recent full seasons, he pitched at least 149 innings in all of those. In 2020, he had 39 innings. Last year, 2021, 149 innings, 150 innings on the dot in 2019, and like I said, in 2018, 172 innings. Now, he did not do that this year. He had injuries. He had 2 IL stints in his first 2 starts. That was not a great start to the season. And the first stint was, in case you remember, the very first game. He had a blister. He had to come out of the game, was getting lit up pretty badly by the Blue Jays, which, again, Blue Jays have a really good offense. So, like, that happens to literally everyone this year. But he came back, and as soon as he did, he had an MCL issue in his knee. Would miss another 10 days, I believe was how long he missed with those first couple. It was 10 days with that first injury, and then 12 days with the knee injury. It took him a little while to get back. And then later on in the season, he had the oblique injury where he missed 42 days, which was just so incredibly rough for the Rangers because, I mean, for as good as he was, the Rangers really relied on him and Martin Perez. I mean, Dane Dunning was fine. He was pretty consistent. He gave over 150 innings, but the rest of the Rangers starters were not consistent or not healthy. Glenn Otto had a couple of stints on the IL and only went 135 innings this year because he would go pretty much 5 innings was a good start for him. But your top dogs, your Martin Perez's and Jon Grays, which Perez did a great job of working deep into games pretty much every single time out. I mean, every time his last 30 starts were 5+ innings, and the same can't be said of Jon Gray. He only had 24 starts, which was the 4th most among the Rangers starting pitchers and the 4th most innings. It was rough out there for Jon Gray in terms of those injuries, but that is something the Rangers knew going in. Thankfully, I talked to our Locked On Rockies host about the injury issues, and he said, that blister is probably not going to be the last one that he has this year. Well, thankfully it was, but there were some other injuries that came up. I was a little worried, and I talked with Grant. I think we talked about this on the podcast, but because of how many sliders he threw, how high a percentage he threw, that is a pitch that is really, really tough on your elbow. And so there was some concern that wasn't going to hold up, that he was going to have some elbow injuries. Well, he didn't have any elbow injuries, but he had the oblique injury of the first game of August, and everything kind of went haywire after that. The Rangers were already struggling. The season was already pretty much done after that subpar month of July, but everything got even worse after that because the Rangers basically could not win games without Jon Gray or Martin Perez on the hill, which makes me think the offense is fine, and with a half decent, maybe above average starting pitching staff, then this team could actually be competitive next year because we saw what they did against some of the best teams early on in the month of May, even while missing a little bit of Jon Gray, even with Martin Perez on his best, but like everybody else in the staff being just like kind of, to be honest. But Jon Gray did have a really, really good stretch in the month of June and July. That was by far his best stretch of the season. Everything looked great. He was a little homer happy in the month of July, but he was overall dominant in those 2 months. And you saw, okay, this is the kind of guy that was a former top 25 consensus prospect in all of baseball, in the top 15 at some places, I think as high as 12 before he made his major league debut. But this guy had a lot of potential. There was a reason why he was drafted number 3 overall, and I think he's still, at this point, the best pitcher in his draft class. There was only one pitcher drafted ahead of him. That was Mark Appel, drafted number 1 overall by the Astros, and he was not good for the Astros, and that's just makes me a little happy. I thought that'd make y'all a little happy, even though the Astros are sitting there waiting for whoever wins Cleveland versus the Yankees on short rest, having to fly out immediately, getting no travel day because, one of those stupid ballparks doesn't have a roof on it. Wouldn't that be inconvenient if a ballpark didn't have a roof on it? Couldn't be us. Couldn't relate as Rangers fans. But that month of July and June, he pitched 68 innings, 81 strikeouts, 20 walks, 20 earned runs, a 2.65 ERA, 10.7 strikeouts per 9, and 2.6 walks per 9. That was Jon Gray at his peak, at his absolute pinnacle of performance. And the best game of the season for him came in that stretch. It actually started off that month of June in that 2-month dominant stretch for him, and it was against Tampa Bay on June 1st. This was a pivotal game, one of the most pivotal games of the season that it's kind of easy to forget about when everything kind of went sideways and it's like, well, everything was going to be terrible no matter what. Well, it wasn't. It wasn't. The Rangers were at 500 heading into the month of June. They would never got above 500. This was their only shot. This was their last shot to get above 500. They would kind of derp around with it a little bit in June. They had an easier schedule that they could have done it a little bit better, but this was their best chance because it was the best start of the season for Jon Gray. This was against Tampa Bay, against former Ranger great Jeffrey Springs. Jon Gray went 7 innings, allowed 3 hits, 1 earned run, 2 walks, and 12 strikeouts. 12 strikeouts on 95 pitches. The guy was just absolutely elite. He had 21 strikes looking, 9 strikes swinging. He was just carving this lineup up, and the only run that he allowed was on a solo shot to the unrightful Rookie of the Year from last year, Randy Arozarena. But the bullpen ended up blowing this game, and the Rangers weren't able to hit with anyone running with runners in scoring position. They went 1 for 12 and left 14 runners on base. This is a game that they should have won. They should have been above 500, but everything this season went sideways. But this was a great showing of Jon Gray absolutely dominating a playoff team, a team that was just coming off a 90-plus win season and winning their division. And this is Jon Gray at his absolute finest. Now, coming up, we're going to look at what kind of expectations can you have for Jon Gray next year, what were my expectations and some external expectations for him this year, and comparing him to some of the other choices the Rangers had in free agency. But first, this word from our sponsors. Now, before the season, I didn't place too many specific number expectations on Jon Gray. The only ones that I really had were I wanted 150 innings, didn't get that. I wanted a sub 4 ERA, we got that, and 9 or more strikeouts per 9. 2 out of 3 ain't bad, and he wasn't particularly close to the 150 innings, but that was my biggest goal, was just get a lot of innings out of him, because that was my main concern with this Rangers rotation going into the season. Is like, okay, you signed Martin Perez, and we didn't really know what he was going to be. He ended up being way better than you could have expected. But even with that, the thought was, okay, the Rangers have, one guy in the rotation who's gone 150 innings in his major league career before the Martin Perez signing, and then they had 2. Dane Dunning ended up going 150 this year, but you needed more. When Glenn Otto was still in the starting rotation, was pretty much going to be a fixture when there were some struggles from Spencer Howard and Taylor Hearn, who I really liked and believed in, but still was pretty healthily skeptical. And neither of those guys ended up working out in the rotation. Spencer Howard isn't really working out anywhere at this moment, but Taylor Hearn at least found his role as a dominant multi-inning reliever. The other guys, not so much. But the Rangers needed some depth from their starting pitching, and it was pretty much just like, here's Jon Gray, and also we threw in a Martin Perez, and this staff that was pretty terrible last year outside of Kyle Gibson, who was traded. There's not a whole lot left here, and there needed to be at least 1, if not 2 more starting pitching additions heading into the season. I get that they were wanting to give Spencer Howard a try. You want to not punt on that Kyle Gibson trade, but it's looking like you're gonna have to stick that guy in the rotation or in the back of the bullpen. Let that nasty stuff eat at like 99 miles an hour, and that's the value you're gonna get for it, and that's it. That's what you got to salvage with that. I hope they're not going to. I get it if they want to try him as a start at the beginning of next year, but I really just think that time is pretty much past. I think they've definitely given up on Taylor Hearn as a starter, but again, Jon Gray was your number 1, and as much as I like him, I think if they were really intent on contending for a playoff spot this year, him being the number 1 was not really the option. But he's not. A lot of times salary gets used to justify this player needs to be better and just like tear down players who got these big contracts and aren't, performing at career levels every single year. And I think that's unfair. But I think one of the things it also does is it sets some expectations. So looking at Jon Gray's salary, he made $15 million this year. That made him the 28th highest paid pitcher in Major League Baseball. That was right on par with Luis Severino, just a little bit behind his former teammate in German Marquez, who made $15.3 million, and just ahead of former Ranger great Kyle Hendricks and free agent this year, Alex Wood. Now, his numbers were a lot better than all those guys. He even made less than Jose Barrios, who had a really, really awful season. Was a guy who I would have really, really liked to have on the Rangers staff. But he had a really, really up and down season. Barrios, who made just a little bit more than Gray. Barrios was the 26th highest paid pitcher at 15.7 mil as opposed to 15 even. Barrios had an ERA over 5. He had a negative 0.5 baseball reference WAR. Even though he did go 172 innings this year, he had a whip of 1.4. It's just not a great season for him. Still had a winning record because the Blue Jays were really darn good. Now, let's look at Luis Severino, who was a guy who had a big up and down season, a 2-time All-Star, which Jon Gray, I don't believe he's made an All-Star team in his career, if I remember correctly. Yeah, no All-Star teams just yet. Maybe next year, if he continues that stretch that he had in June and July and does that early on in the season. But Luis Severino was a little bit more effective in the innings that he pitched, but he did pitch fewer innings than Jon Gray this year. Severino had 19 starts, 102 innings, and a 3.18 ERA. And a 1.6 baseball reference WAR. So just a little bit higher than his. Eduardo Rodriguez was another guy who got a pretty big contract for Detroit, and everyone thought, oh no, Detroit's going to get this great guy coming off a fine, not great season for the Boston Red Sox, but he got, I believe, a 4-year deal with Detroit, and everyone thought, okay, this guy's going to be really darn good. Excuse me, it was more than 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5-year deal with the Tigers, and he did not live up to anywhere close to his expectations. He didn't even pitch 100 innings this year. He had a 4.05 ERA in 17 starts, 91 innings. Yeah, not anywhere close to what Jon Gray did this year. Another guy, Alex Wood, who just also did not have the greatest of seasons. 130 innings in 26 starts, 5.10 ERA, and Kyle Hendricks, another guy who's making just a little bit less than him, a .5 baseball reference for 16 starts, 4.80 ERA, and 84 and a third innings. So you look at about what he's getting paid, and that he's about performing that. He's kind of overperforming that just a little bit. Some of the guys who are around his range in his salary. I mean, there are a couple guys who are performing a little bit better. They're making just a little bit more. Blake Snell at $16.5 million. Aaron Noah at $16 million, who had a fantastic season. Would have loved to have Jon Gray have a season like that. But they're kind of a similar pitcher, both guys who get a bunch of strikeouts and don't walk a whole bunch of guys. Lance McCullers, who was hurt for most of the season, but still provided a lot of value while he was there. But not a whole lot of guys below him that outperformed him outside of, well, Luis Castillo, who, again, would have been nice, but the Rangers were not in a position to go make that kind of a trade for him. But ideally, where does he slot in on a staff that is competing for the playoffs? Well, I don't think he should be your number 1. I don't even think he should be your number 2. I think he can perform like it, and I think when he's healthy, he is that. But you need that depth, that those amount of guys that you can count on for 150 to 180 innings to get you through. I mean, you can have guys like Dane Dunning or Glenn Otto slot in occasionally. Dane Dunning, I think, can consistently be that back end of the rotation starter to get you those 150, maybe 180 innings next year. We'll see how that goes, but I don't think you can totally rely on Jon Gray to get you those 200 innings because, again, he hasn't done that before. He's only got one season that he has over 160 innings. So, yeah, it's not something that you can be just put in the bank and feel super duper confident. Excuse me. He has two seasons of over 160 innings, but still, when he's on, he is absolutely dominant. He had the first 10 plus strikeout game for any Rangers pitcher since 2020, back when Lance Lynn did it, had a 10 strikeout game on September 13th against the Mariners. But it's been a while. The Rangers have not had a lot of really great strikeout pitchers. Even when Kyle Gibson was really going last year, he was not a big strikeout guy. Would have been nice to have been able to keep Lance Lynn because you put Lance Lynn on this rotation, healthy Lance Lynn. If the Rangers could have kept him healthy, which he hasn't been basically since the Rangers traded him to Chicago, then this might have been a team that was much closer to 500. You keep Lance Lynn on this staff as opposed to Dane Dunning, then that is a big old upgrade for this Rangers team. But it made sense to do it at the time. Maybe the Rangers can sign Lance Lynn whenever he becomes a free agent in 2024 or something. Yeah, earliest free agent is in 2024. Or maybe they work a backsies. They just go, whoopsie, hey Chicago, it hasn't really worked out for Lance Lynn there. Do you want a guy who's going to be more healthy and stay in your rotation a little bit more in Dane Dunning and just take your boy back? I don't know if they would do that. I don't know if the Rangers would do that. I think they probably would, but still, would have been nice to have somebody else slot in there and be that consistent workhorse that Lance Lynn was. So the Rangers are going to need to do some spending on some starting pitching. Obviously, priority numero uno is getting Martin Perez. Again, like I said in his recap episode last week, I don't know if that's necessarily going to be, this season is going to be something that he performs exactly like this and just has a sub 3 ERA from every year on. I do think he got a little bit of luck, but he did have a significant improvement in the confidence and the ability to just go out there and go at hitters and trust his stuff, which I think is something that is going to continue, which is why I think the Rangers should give him a 4 or 5 year deal to keep him here, because outside of him and Jon Gray, Martin Perez, that is, this rotation really, really is in need of some desperate upgrades. I think they can get there, and I think Jon Gray is a really, really solid. If he's your number 3, you have a really darn good staff. But if he is your number 1, then I think that adds a lot more questions and puts a lot more on him than the Rangers probably should have this year. Granted, he performed well while he was there, had his ups and downs, but I think overall, this is still a really solid season. And man, if we can see those months of June and July for an extended period, even turn that into 3 months, then and keep him healthy, go less than a month on the IL for the season, then that's definitely a guy you can rely on in the middle or towards the top of the rotation and go give him the ball in a playoff game if the Rangers end up getting there next year. That's going to do it for this edition of Locked On Rangers. For your next listen, go check out Locked On MLB. Paul Francis Sullivan, please call him Sully. He gives you his unique perspective on the major leagues, both past and present. On tomorrow's show, I'm going to be taking a little bit of a break from these player breakdowns. I'll be talking with Grant Schiller Tuesday tonight as I am recording this, hopefully get at least 1 or 2 episodes recapping AA and AAA seasons, talking a little bit about Kumar Rocker in the Arizona Fall League and what all is the deal with that. Maybe even some thoughts on the Major League Club. Who knows how it goes? It's always a lot of fun talking with Grant, so be sure to check those episodes out and check out Locked On MLB, which is free wherever you get your podcast. Thank you all so much for listening and subscribing, and until next time, don't forget to enjoy baseball.